Rushing for the train, the man dropped some documents in Chinese, and as soon as a little vagabond picked them up and uttered 3 words, the sweet voice singing talent of Esteban was both his pride and his headache. He had always sung for as long as he could remember. Most children begin speaking early in life, but he didn't speak. He immediately set words to music, and he chose any background for his speech. Like people of old, he sang about everything he saw, borrowing melodies from songs, arias, and romances he had once heard somewhere. His head was full of a jumble of singing sounds. Another person might not have made sense of this musical chaos, but Esteban didn't mind. For every shade of his mood, he had an accompaniment. At first, his gifted boy's parents were overwhelmed, but then they grew used to the fact that their son almost always spoke in song. At 5, he began attending music school, where he was immediately in high demand. Perfect pitch, enviable memory, a marvelous voice, sensitive fingers that mastered instruments and merged with them as one. If he heard something just once, he could already play it on the piano. His keyboard teacher, once she met this prodigy, wouldn't let the string specialist near him, joking, "I never thought I'd meet in my professional career either a young Mozart or a little Chopin. This boy has been kissed by God himself. I've never seen such musical inspiration and such innate ability in a person." Esteban grew up successfully, mastering the accordion and piano, but soon these faded into the background. When he became the undisputed winner of the regional young vocalists competition, he woke up the next morning famous. Not only his music school, but the entire regional artistic community immediately knew about the young talent. No one cared anymore that Esteban could virtuously accompany himself. Everyone delighted only in the velvet, silk, and shimmering colors of his voice. People predicted for him the careers of Carlos Gardel, Atahualpa Yupanqui, or even Alberto Cortez. Esteban could with equal ease sing with a husky tone, then flawlessly perform an aria, hit the high notes, and then drop his voice down several octaves again. His vocal teacher insisted that after puberty, his voice would bring even more surprises. The experienced mentor was not mistaken. Voice change struck Esteban at 14 and tormented him cruelly. As though in revenge for his gift, his vocal cords protested too violently, unable to decide what timbre to give the future singer. According to physiological laws, his boyish high notes should have dropped significantly, but no one expected his voice to acquire the tones of a 40 or 50-year-old man. There were even comic situations. When Esteban answered the phone, the person on the other end was absolutely sure they were speaking with his father or even his grandfather. Such was the surprise that a simple age-related mutation of his voice brought him. In a strange way, his sound changed too. The flawless purity of tone was distorted, but instead his timbre acquired a certain mystery. Such voices are usually heard from men singing in restaurants, and the best genre for them is undoubtedly bolero, the gentleman of courteous compositions. Now, whenever Esteban found himself in any company, he immediately attracted fans, especially female ones. Women were ready to follow that voice like rats behind the Pied Piper's flute. For the last 2 years of music school, because of his voice break, Esteban almost couldn't sing at all, only for his own, rarely and briefly. He first returned to the stage at his general school's graduation ball. He sang a song dedicated to his first teacher and enchanted the hall. Since he had to take a step back from his vocal career, he switched to sports. He managed athletics training and swimming. The result came quickly. Now Esteban had not only a captivating, unusual voice, but also a very attractive appearance. Preening in front of the mirror in the restroom, one of the very young elementary teachers even openly declared, "Oh, colleagues, if only this guy were 5 years older, I'd follow his voice to the ends of the earth without hesitation. There's something in him, a little mystical, almost devilish. My younger sister has long been head over heels in love with him. She studied with him at the same music school. But how could a little girl like her get near him? She'll have to wait another 10 years before he even notices her. You'd better find out which of your little rascals broke the cafeteria window with a ball on the first floor." The head teacher reproached the daring young woman. "Before your kids started attending your summer club, all the windows in the school were intact. Fail to find the culprit, and you'll be paying for the glass yourself." The young woman only smiled in reply. I know for sure this disgrace wasn't my pupils' doing. At my request, their parents all bring them to class and pick them up together. And while we're sculpting or drawing, their hands are busy. No time for mischief. Naturally, Esteban had no idea of such conversations about him at school. He was at a crossroads. He passed his final exams at school with good marks. He graduated from music school with brilliance. Yet here was the problem. He didn't see himself in any profession. To establish himself in the musical field, his abilities were no longer enough. Once, having given priority to vocal training, he had neglected his instrumental skills. He received his diploma, but played mostly for himself, not for a wide audience. His voice also let him down. Having changed so much, it left him no chance to take a worthy place among solo vocalists, and he never saw himself in a choir. The circle of admiring fans didn't please him either. He was no womanizer chasing every skirt. He didn't go on dates, didn't change girlfriends like gloves. He was indifferent to all that. Esteban was still obsessed with music, but seeing how much effort it had taken his parents to raise him, educate him, and make sure he had no less than others, he didn't want to be selfish. He needed to firmly stand on his own feet, get a breadwinning profession, all the more so since the family was raising his younger brother. The age gap between them was large, and their parents, alas, were not eternal. Torn between angel and devil in choosing his future path, Esteban did not accept the offer to join a rock band. Tempting though it was, that musical genre attracted him least of all. Romantic notes lived in his soul. The city romance was closest to him. He longed to perform some beautiful ballad. The only thing he couldn't stand were prison songs in the narco corrido style. But by some cruel irony, in his performance, they sounded especially moving. It reached the point where he was invited to gatherings of crime bosses. They didn't stint on dollars and treated him with a certain respect. Once, after a cabaret concert for his people, a well-known drug baron patted Esteban on the shoulder and said, "You know how to touch the soul? We've already paid your fee, but remember this. If you ever need anything on our side, consider it repaid for your singing." I don't waste words. And with that, they parted. Esteban nevertheless chose the profession of marketing specialist. It was fashionable and, as promised, promising for the future. At the Institute, he tried not to stand out. For 5 years, he lived the life of an ordinary, unremarkable student. No one in his group or in the whole cohort even suspected that on Fridays and Saturdays, their classmate went out of town on improvised tours with 2 other musicians. They earned a modest income, entertaining wedding guests or performing wholeheartedly at some provincial corporate party. Their musical trips ended as quietly as they had begun. By the final year, their trio had dissolved on its own. Each went his own way. After receiving his diploma, Esteban got a job at a large company, at first as an ordinary specialist. Things went well. He turned out to have a sharp instinct for which of the manufacturer's products could conquer the market. Quickly, gracefully, and profitably. Esteban could pinpoint the target audience with virtuosity. In theory, his achievements sometimes seemed almost insane, especially given that his company produced nothing more than ordinary fasteners. But competent advertising did its job. Within a year, he rightfully occupied the position of head of the marketing department. To understand what Esteban's creation was, one needn't look far. Fasteners, the life-saving sticks and stones for building anything. Ask any handyman, and he'll explain that the term metizzi arose from the shortened metal products. And it would be a mistake to think the word refers only to a rod with a thread and a head, that is, a bolt. The factory where the young marketer worked diligently produced an endless variety of fasteners for all occasions: screws, washers, nails, studs, and of course, the notorious bolts. To the uninitiated, such metal goods might seem trivial, but without these little things, no manufactured item would exist at all. That's more or less how Esteban usually began his client presentations of new products. First, he gave a lecture on the possibilities of the items, persuaded them to buy, and proved that quality was not an empty word for his company. Then he would gently, persuasively proceed to promote his beloved metal goods. After all, a bad merchant is one who doesn't love his wares and can't share that love with interested parties. Then came the unexpected. Chinese partners suddenly showed interest in the factory's broad assortment of metal products. Everyone knows the Chinese can make everything. The whole world looks to their engineers' skill. And yet, out of the blue, Chinese comrades decided to purchase a large batch of fasteners in Latin America. The deal was extremely profitable for the factory. The signing of the contract was celebrated loudly and joyfully. They held a banquet at a nearby restaurant, and to impress the guests even more, they asked Esteban to perform something. By then, his singing talent was no longer a secret to his colleagues. Ever since he had won the company's New Year vocal contest, he was famous for it throughout the plant. The workers, foremen, and shop managers had no time to bother Esteban with requests to sing again. Everyone had their own tasks. They understood the truth well: business first, and there would be time for entertainment later. But the Chinese wouldn't let Esteban leave the stage. If anyone at the party had carefully observed the group of foreign partners, they would have noticed something strange. As soon as the factory's nightingale sang his first song, one of the Chinese kept making calls, enthusiastically telling someone something. Then he asked the interpreter questions, then showered dollars on the orchestra, whispered again with the interpreter, and ordered new songs in different languages. The company director asked Esteban to indulge the guest and not refuse. Esteban himself already missed music. By then he performed rarely, only when old friends from the criminal world summoned him. He never argued with them. He sensed in them a kind of reckless romance. Besides, they never tried to drag him into their dark business, not even by a hint. They protected his talent. The banquet celebrating the mutually beneficial contract couldn't last forever. As lively as the evening had been, it was time to part ways. In the following days, Esteban prepared and packed all the fastener samples for the Chinese partners, checked the accompanying technical documents. So there was no time left for sentiment or singing, and yet he was struck by the moment when one Chinese man, accompanied by an interpreter, approached him with a rather unusual request. "Senor Esteban, would you grant me a delicate favor? I would like you to give a solo concert just for me. You are the singer and I, the only audience." Esteban was extremely busy with the final preparations for the departure of the new partners. Besides, that request had seemed far too strange to him. So he smiled at the Chinese gentleman, excused himself on account of work, and left it at that. If only he had known that this story would have a continuation that would affect his own fate. For now he was very pleased with himself, since management had promised him, after the signing of this highly profitable contract, a transfer to the head office in Buenos Aires and a new position as marketing director at his company. Esteban was delighted with the prospects ahead. Hadn't he earned such changes and such a dizzying promotion through his efforts? Espiransa wandered around the train station, bored. She had already exceeded her plan for obtaining money that day. She caught a plump lady with a fat wallet, plump in the sense that it was stuffed with large bills. The careless woman had dropped a small handbag on the platform, dragging behind her two heavy suitcases on wheels. Espiransa hadn't even needed to lift it. The prize had simply fallen into her nimble hands. The passenger hadn't even realized what had happened before she had noticeably slimmed down. Now that she was a full 18 years old, Espiransa looked like a tomboy, short, thin, with a body not yet fully formed. No one would have given her more than 14 or 15, and it would never have crossed anyone's mind that this seemingly youthful creature had already learned so much of sorrow and grief. Once, Espiransa had lived in a respectable family where everyone worked as teachers in schools or professors at universities. Now that biography was worth nothing. She had become a nimble pickpocket, known by the nickname Espiransa. When she first ended up on the street, none of the older ones in their circle had imagined the girl had such talent for stealing. The most likely reason lay in the fact that she had studied violin for 3 years at a music school. Her delicate small fingers had been trained and sensitive, and her very first theft was a bag of chocolate candies she lifted from the pocket of a hurried student's jacket. At that moment, a logical chain became firmly established in Espiransa's mind. A little sleight of hand, and instantly something tasty and filling. By nature, she wasn't a thief. She became one out of sheer necessity to survive. Espiransa's father had been a skilled professional, an outstanding expert in the Chinese language and Chinese culture. From infancy, he taught both daughters this difficult tongue as well. From the cradle, in their home, they all spoke freely in both Spanish and Chinese. For fun, they would begin a phrase in one language and finish it in the other. As soon as the girls spoke their first words, they lived under this method and never complained. Her mother, the present-day vagabond's mother, was no less remarkable, a professor of higher mathematics at the university. True, she never succeeded in passing her love for formulas onto her daughters. Both were more inclined toward the humanities. The younger, Espiransa, also had a natural pull toward music. But all the joys of life for their family ended in an instant. Statistics say that, in terms of global catastrophes, air travel is the safest form of transportation. But with Espiransa's family, statistics stumbled, failed, and faltered. An innocent vacation in the Caribbean turned into disaster for 16-year-old Espiransa. The plane carrying Latin American passengers never made it to Buenos Aires. On board were all three: her father, her mother, and her older sister. Espiransa herself hadn't flown to the Caribbean for a banal reason. She had caught a severe cold. Doctors suspected a viral infection, strongly recommended she avoid contact with others, and so she remained home under the care of an elderly neighbor. The prepaid tickets couldn't go to waste. Later, that plane crash was recognized as the largest in terms of Latin American casualties in history. But who did that help? At the time, Espiransa saw nothing, heard nothing, understood nothing. Following the loss of all her loved ones came another disaster. The cold brought complications, which turned into a nervous breakdown. She spent an entire year in a psychiatric clinic until she was stabilized. Her symptoms weren't dangerous to those around her, but they tried not to leave Espiransa alone. The doctors were mostly erring on the side of caution, but the fact remained. For a time, she was legally considered incapacitated. Her days in the hospital were all alike: strange fellow patients, endless pills, fog, merciful sleep. Occasionally, a doctor would come by, listen, make her show her tongue, ask incomprehensible questions, then leave. Her mind recovered slowly, first with faint glimpses of clarity, then with the ability to recognize herself in others. More and more independence followed. First walks in the hospital park, clearer conversations, and finally recovery. That year was the darkest of Espiransa's life. When she was discharged with the verdict, practically healthy, shocking news awaited her. While she had been deprived of all rights, a cunning distant relative had somehow managed to inherit her family's apartment. How, where, and with whom she settled the matter was unknown, but the apartment was sold to unsuspecting strangers. It proved impossible to evict those new residents. Who was she? By then just a 17-year-old who hadn't even finished secondary school, a rootless orphan, in essence homeless. How the apartment had been sold with such encumbrances remained a mystery. The relatives who had danced on the bones of her tragedy disappeared without a trace. Try finding the wind in a field. Whoosh, gone. For a week, Espiransa stayed with the same elderly neighbor her parents had once been close with. But then the old woman's children came to visit for the holidays. Espiransa's conscience didn't allow her to impose longer. Their small provincial town lay close to the capital. Espiransa gathered her strength and rushed to Buenos Aires to lose herself in the crowd of city dwellers and tourists. A strange story also happened with her personal belongings and family property. She found no trace of her clothes or of anything from her sister's and parents' former apartment. As if it had all evaporated. She didn't fight for her rights. Turned out too weak for that. It's easy to shake your head at someone else's misfortune, but not so easy to deal with its consequences yourself. Espiransa vaguely remembered a single visit, presumably from the very same relatives who had so brazenly disposed of her apartment. That woman had brought her a large bag of the bare necessities to the hospital. It was with this meager wealth that Espiransa appeared at one of the railway stations of the city the world calls the Pearl of the Rio de la Plata. Espiransa knew beautiful Buenos Aires fairly well. Despite lacking any educational documents, she dreamed of finding a job. But her decent knowledge of Chinese wasn't enough for that, and other subjects had somehow slipped away from her memory. At first, she found work, off the books, as a dishwasher in a diner that pretended to have a Chinese-style menu, but lasted only a week. The owner brought in a family from Paraguay instead, on the principle that he could pay them less than locals and demand much more. Living in a hostel, Espiransa once again found herself without any means of survival. She looked around, and her home was now the street itself, with nowhere to go carrying her modest belongings. Espiransa had read somewhere that a person can go without food for several weeks, in rare cases even months. She couldn't do that. She quickly learned to collect half-empty bottles of water near trash bins. But when it came to food, she was too squeamish. She wouldn't touch scraps. After spending one night at the station, she realized this wasn't a solution. Police raids on passengers were regular, and suspicious individuals were taken away. What saved Espiransa was her appearance. She looked like a decent girl from a good family. Yes, skinny, but with an intelligent face, clever eyes, still in clean, modest clothes, without a hint of anything vulgar or provocative. Buenos Aires was in the grip of the hot summer season then. Crowds of young people from the provinces had come to the city to have fun. It was impossible to tell where night ended and twilight began. Esperanza blended into the masses and, for the time being, aroused no suspicion from the authorities. If only she weren't so constantly hungry. One day she followed a girl who kept reaching into her pocket and pulling out a chocolate candy in a bright wrapper. When the young lady grew careless, worn out by hunger, Espiransa herself didn't even realize how she snatched those damn candies. What's more, she barely noticed how she instantly devoured all 5 of them. It was divine. She had never eaten anything so delicious in her life. Espiransa was so absorbed in her prize that she didn't notice 2 inquisitive eyes watching her. On a nearby bench sat an outwardly respectable elderly gentleman, enjoying the city's pulse. He was the seasoned crime boss known as Jean Valentin, surname Valentino. At that moment, he was recruiting newcomers for his team of pickpockets, since a recent police raid had seriously reduced the number of his subordinates. The porteños, as well as the tourists delighting in the city's attractions, had no idea that the southern capital was crawling with people of every criminal stripe. Among them, pickpockets were in high demand. More than that, they were respected. After all, the city was full of scatter-brained folk wandering about every day. Osvaldo Valentino was an experienced man. Like his literary namesake, he had spent a total of 19 years in prison. He had been a legendary pickpocket until he lost 3 fingers on his right hand. He trained, tried to put his left hand to the craft, but it didn't work out. And by then it was time for him to stop cutting purses himself and start training the next generation. And here it was, Jean Valentin's Buenos Aires School of Pickpockets. The master could spot talented thieves at once. He instantly realized that Esperanza's fingers were magical, long before she herself knew it. He didn't want to frighten his unexpected discovery right away. He approached the matter indirectly, politely introduced himself to the girl, pretending to be a somewhat bored tourist who had gotten lost in Buenos Aires. It went something like this. "Good afternoon, young lady. Could you help me? I seem to have lost my bearings in the capital. I was looking for Corrientes Avenue, but I got tired and sat down to rest. Could you tell me which way I should go next? And I'm also very hungry. Can't decide where I might have some dinner." Jean Valentin didn't miss how, at the word dinner, his companion involuntarily twitched, and he immediately thought, "She's very hungry. I'll win her over with a good meal." Half an hour later, they were both sitting in a cozy cafe on Avenida de Mayo. Esperanza couldn't get enough to eat, while Valentino was carefully studying her before moving on to the main point. The unexpected sponsor's proposal that she try working with him didn't shock Esperanza. She wasn't even surprised that her new acquaintance wasn't a tourist at all, but the leader of the pickpockets. After all she'd endured in the past year, nothing could frighten her anymore. From the cafe, they went straight to the apartment Jean Valentin had turned into a sort of hostel for those without homes of their own. Later, he never once regretted taking the girl along. Esperanza's gift for stealing was rare. One could even say exceptional. After 6 months in this peculiar commune, Esperanza had learned to fulfill, and even exceed, the plan for cleaning out wallets, bundles, and the pockets of simpletons. She could spot a potential victim in a crowd instantly. She misjudged the contents of wallets only a couple of times, in cases where people looked wealthy but had almost no pesos in their pockets. Victims of Esperanza's thefts rarely reported to the police. Buenos Aires beckoned with new adventures, and no one wanted to waste time in vain. After all, a pickpocket would never be found. Empty trouble. In Valentino's household, strict rules reigned. All spoils went to the master. He himself then distributed the rightful share. In an intelligent, cultured city, so as not to stand out too sharply, one had to look the part. That was how Espiransa acquired two sets of uniforms. One for visiting palaces and museums, the other for street hunting. A modest dress in classic tones imperceptibly turned Espiransa into something like a student from an art school who had wandered into a museum to admire the canvases of famous masters. The most profitable days for Espiransa in museums were when many tours were being held there. The slender girl with her inspired face never aroused suspicion of anything illicit. Even when victims of theft quickly discovered their loss, no one ever cast a glance at Espiransa, taking her for just another art lover. She was no less successful in the streets, disguised as a carefree schoolgirl. She blended into the crowd like a lively current, brushed against someone for only a second, and walked away with her catch. Again, no one paid attention to the little girl in dark jeans, a hoodie with a cheerful print, and a cap with a big visor. Ordinary people usually imagine pickpockets as young boys, not as a fragile girl, a sparrow, a little bird with big, innocent gray eyes. Anyone could have stolen the wallet, anyone but her. Jean Valentin was a strict but fair mentor, not a tyrant to those who tried and reliably brought in income for the common fund. Mondays were always a legitimate day off. Each received a small bonus for entertainment, and the whole gang would head to the cinema or a pastry shop. Espiransa rarely joined such outings. More often, she caught up on sleep. Hunger no longer tormented her. The teacher strictly monitored his ward's diet. As the only female among them, she could lazily watch romantic melodramas on television or lie around all day with a book in hand. Valentino did not burden his crew with housekeeping. Domestic chores were entrusted to a silent woman who spoke almost no Spanish but faithfully carried out every task assigned to her. Espiransa understood with her mind that what she was so skillfully doing was wrong, and that her life was empty and confined within narrow bounds. The man she obeyed without question liked to say, "To enter costs 1 peso, to leave costs 2. And you chicks have nowhere to hide if you think of rebelling. I am your father, mother, godfather, brother, and teacher. Understood?" Valentino's team consisted of 7 adolescents between 12 and 15. All were orphans or from marginal families, where their existence had long been forgotten. They wandered, lived somewhere on Buenos Aires' streets, and so be it. Among them, Espiransa was the oldest, the most talented, and perhaps the most homeless of all. And after 18, it was hard to even call her an adolescent. More and more, she was trying on the role of the crime boss's right hand, leading the crew to their spots, collecting the day's take on Valentino's orders, and turning it over to the boss. She was content with it, though at times a worm of doubt stirred inside her. Thoughts tormented her. So what then? After this, I'll go straight into retirement from this den? Not much of a prospect. But for now, I can't change my life. In secret from her housemates, Espiransa set up a stash in the bathroom's ventilation hatch, an idea she had picked up from the series The Master and Margarita. Every Monday, she put aside a little money from her bonus, saving for a rainy day, and she very much hoped no one would ever find out. Lately, she had taken to dressing like a little street urchin, as if begging in a noisy, bustling train station, where there was always something to profit from. Jean Valentin disliked train stations, but he didn't stop Espiransa from choosing them. For him, she was a goldmine. Letting her go free would cost him dearly. She had been working with him for almost 2 years and hadn't made a single mistake. It was the sly maid who secretly reported Espiransa's stash to him while the others were out working. The old fox dug it out, counted it, and delivered his verdict to himself. At this pace, Espiransa will be saving for the rest of her life. I can rest easy. She won't run off. And everything in the little world of pickpockets ran smoothly until Jean was summoned by people higher up in their hierarchy. They gave him an unusual assignment, to steal a folder of documents from a certain man. Or rather, not the whole folder, but a few important sheets. For Osvaldo Valentino's subordinates, the task was far too unusual. This wasn't a wallet or a watch. Papers were much more troublesome. But he couldn't refuse these people. He returned to his school hoping one of the kids might suggest something clever. Young minds were sometimes more inventive, but he didn't even need to speak to them. At that moment, only Espiransa was in the apartment. Jean immediately shared his concern with her, and she unexpectedly assured him, "I'll try to help you with this job. Only I need details about our target. Photos of the man or woman from whom I have to get the papers. Before I approach them, I need to watch them for a while." Valentino found Esperanza's reasoning quite sound. He pulled a photo of the man out of his pocket and handed it to her. She looked closely at the picture, and suddenly the ground shifted beneath her feet. From the photograph, Esteban was gazing back at her. Her childhood love. The boy with the magical voice that could reach the soul. The classmate from music school. Her romantic idol. A glimpse from her happy past. A shard of ice cracked in her heart. Tears welled in her eyes. To cover it up, Esperanza coughed, as if something had tickled her throat. She would follow Esteban, and if necessary, she would help him in everything. At that moment, she was torn apart with impatience, to see him as soon as possible, to find out everything about him. The next morning, Esperanza took up a lookout post near the building where the head office of the fastener company was located. She still could not believe in such an unexpected coincidence. She took the assignment from the crime bosses as a good omen for herself. It was time to change something in her life, and Esteban would become the saving bridge that would turn her fate upside down. Jean Valentine used to tell his protégés, "There are no accidents." Espiransa believed in that saying wholeheartedly. It was no accident she had gotten sick and missed the tragic Caribbean flight. No accident she had stolen chocolate candies from the pocket of a careless young lady and caught Valentino's eye. No accident that this very task of stealing documents had come to their gang. 2 hours in ambush flew by, almost unnoticed. That day, Espiranza was dressed as a cultured artist. So when a group of girls came outside to smoke on a bench, she was able to win their trust and discreetly ask a little about Esteban. Clever detectives make a big mistake when they go looking for information sources in high places. Usually, it is the quiet, inconspicuous personality in any team who knows everything about everyone. And Espiranza immediately spotted such a person now. This young woman didn't smoke with the others, but modestly sat at the edge of the bench, eyes lowered. She fell right into Espiranza's hands. Espiranza, experienced at recognizing weak points in people. The girl started casually, greeted her, introduced herself. "Good afternoon. Would you mind if I sat here?" The gray cardinal in a skirt did not object to Espiranza sitting beside her, and Espiranza smiled to herself. She immediately noticed that the woman kept glancing at her handbag. Clearly, something valuable was hidden there, perhaps an advance or wages. But today, hunting for wallets was not in Espiranza's plans. She smiled charmingly at her new acquaintance and confided, "I really like one of your colleagues, such a handsome man. I know for sure his name is Esteban and that he works in marketing." Espiranza had little information about the person from her childhood, from her hometown, so she probed carefully. Esteban's colleague saw nothing suspicious in her words and at once began to share eagerly about the company's new employee. "If it's the man I think, then he's more than just an ordinary marketer. He came to Buenos Aires a couple of months ago, straight into the position of our company's marketing director. The single ladies in our department didn't just lightly sniff around his personal life, they dug into it thoroughly. Handsome, smart, promising, an enviable groom. For someone as young as you, he probably won't pay attention. A little bird told us that before moving here, he lived with a girlfriend, but she, for some unknown reason, refused to move with him. I don't think you'll get anywhere with him. They say he is very selective and has no plans to marry, since he is already married to his job. He spends day and night in the office. Soon Esteban is due for a long trip to China. At work, everyone is speculating whether he'll go alone or if some colleague will accompany him. Nothing has been decided yet. Espiranza soaked up all this information like a sponge. Instinct told her it was not yet the time to show herself to Esteban, nor was it the time to remind him who she was. From her talkative new friend, she asked only one more question. "And this Esteban of yours, the one I like so much, does he have parents, any relatives?" Esperanza longed to know at least something about the man who came from her own hometown. That old life in the province now seemed quiet and calm. Life in Buenos Aires was stormy and reckless, but she yearned for a golden mean, to be needed and important to someone, to have a home to return to, and a hearth where she could keep the fire alive. Esperanza dreamed of family, of that cozy substance which in her case had once been devoured by the sky over the Caribbean Sea. Inside, she had never reconciled herself to being alone in the whole wide world. Sometimes she dreamed dreams, memories in which all four of them chattered cheerfully in Chinese. Why in Chinese? Esperanza didn't know the answer. To secure her budding acquaintance with Esteban's chatty colleague, Esperanza staged a touching little scene. She shed a tear or two, brushed away the sparkling drops from her sad gray eyes, and invited the woman to a pastry shop under the respectable pretext of talking more about the subject of her unrequited love. Tomorrow at lunchtime, perhaps. She earnestly asked Rosario, for by now they had exchanged names, to find out more about Esteban. As a gift, she slipped off her wrist an elegant silver bracelet with stones, which she had lifted early that morning from a distracted woman in the metro while she was gripping the handrail. Rosario's eyes gleamed with delight. The piece was exquisite, and she immediately promised Esperanza that tomorrow she would gather a whole dossier on Esteban. With that, they parted. Espiransa was so inspired by her conversation with Rosario that by evening she even managed to surprise Jean Valentin himself. She had spent her working shift at the Museum of Fine Arts, packed with tours. Who would believe it if another thief told them? But under the rush of daring, Espiransa managed to sneak up on a wealthy foreign lady being wheeled around the museum halls in a wheelchair. When her art-loving companion stepped away to the restroom, Esperanza whisked from the old lady's neck a priceless necklace of diamonds and emeralds, and she never felt a thing. Esperanza's magical fingers were at their sharpest that day. For her collection, she also snatched from an elderly gentleman his pocket watch and chain peeking out of his vest. Back at the apartment, she cheerfully tossed to Jean Valentin. They had no business trying to imitate our aristocracy. Our Creole lords and patrons, with all their treasures, are second to none, a head above all European rulers. They should have kept a better eye on their diamonds and spent less time imagining themselves as patrons of museums. Esperanza now waited with immense impatience for her next meeting with Rosario. Something told her that events would move swiftly from here, and she wasn't wrong. Her new acquaintance flew into the cafe pastry shop with burning eyes and began her report practically from the doorway. Espiransa, you can't imagine what dizzying news I have. Esteban is leaving on a long business trip the day after tomorrow. He's taking a packet of documents to our new partners in China. Then he'll stay in the Middle Kingdom to set up something there. I only found out today, secretly, that we snatched these partners almost from under the nose of some well-known Buenos Aires businessman who supposedly is an ex. Ex what? Esperanza didn't understand. Ex-porteño bandit from the 90s. By now, all legends. We were barely even born back when they were running things. Maybe not even born at all. If we were still crawling under the table. I overheard that one of these so-called exes, if they can ever really be exes, went into a fury that the Chinese had chosen us. I don't know what exactly they had against each other, but Esteban is taking the documents practically in secret through Cordoba. From there, he'll catch a flight to Beijing. In Esperanza's mind, all the details snapped into a single picture. So this was her assignment, to latch onto Esteban, snatch the papers from him, and pass them on to Jean Valentin's boss. Everything ingenious is always simple. The sheets they wanted were the ones with signatures so they could destroy or at least stall the business agreement. The 21st century outside, yet in the criminal world, they still live by old rules. Was there truly no other way to block this deal with the Chinese? Something here didn't feel right. Esperanza treated Rosario to media lunas and alfajores, downed her cortado in haste, and rushed home. Now she knew exactly when the train to Cordoba departed. Retiro Station was like her second home. She knew it as well as the back of her hand, after all the time she had spent working and loitering there. The day after tomorrow, she would stage a whole spectacle right on the platform. And even if Valentin and all his cronies didn't hand her an Oscar for it, or whatever famous theater prizes there were, she would still play her part. At last, the momentous day arrived. Esperanza had hardly slept the night before, agonizing over what to pack in her little backpack. Then she grew tired of the thoughts and doubts, gave up, and pulled out her secret stash from the ventilation shaft. If needed, she'd spend it on daily necessities. She couldn't explain why she was certain she wouldn't be going back to Jean Valentin. Either something would go wrong, or she simply wouldn't want to return. Jean wasn't around, and she didn't care about being spied on by their housemaid. Something had shifted in the instant she saw Esteban's face in that photograph. She didn't know what awaited her ahead, but she felt sure great changes were once again coming into her life. Esteban's morning on the day of departure turned out hectic. He was leaving for China for several months and had to hand over the keys to his landlady. There was another worry too. A month earlier, he had found a tiny kitten by a dumpster. Pitiful little thing, eyes barely open and already homeless. He had taken it in, and by now the furry creature felt like the true master of his apartment. Tidy, clean, undemanding in food. Every evening it waited faithfully for Esteban to return from work, eager to climb onto his shoulder and purr there. Now Esteban had no idea where to leave his pet. An animal shelter seemed cruel, and he had no time to knock on neighbors' doors. The solution came at the last possible moment. As he was already at the taxi, ready to head to the station, he suddenly ran into his colleague, Rosario. He told her of his predicament with the kitten, and the young woman agreed to keep it for him temporarily. Problem solved, Esteban glanced at his watch. Just minutes remained before departure. Luckily, traffic had been light that evening. If he ran without stopping, he could still make the train. The locomotive was already steaming. He was just steps from the right carriage when disaster struck. A young girl darted into him like a comet, knocking the precious folder of documents from his hands. Papers scattered across the platform in a messy fan, and Esteban, running, even stepped on a page. Rain had been falling all day in Buenos Aires, and now an ugly wet stain spread across the once white sheet. The girl looked at him with large, innocent gray eyes and seemed ready to burst into tears. Then she began frantically picking up the papers and thrusting them back into his hands. He couldn't bring himself to scold her. He grabbed the documents as they were and leapt onto the train, already in motion. In such a rush, Esteban didn't see that his accidental misfortune, in female form, had also slipped into the next carriage at the last moment. There was no magic in it. Once again, coincidences that weren't coincidences had intervened. Espiransa had bought herself a proper official ticket for the same train. She wasn't about to risk this mission. Her seat was in the next carriage. She had already decided not to take the documents right away. Too crude. First, she would carefully examine their contents. Something inside her was uneasy. And then came another surprise. She had managed to notice that part of the papers were in Spanish and part in Chinese, and the two versions said entirely different things. That was all she had time to glimpse. But it was enough. The papers were a mystery. Life had taught Espiransa several very useful things. In particular, the wisdom of knowing when to apply her skills and when it was better to remain a law-abiding young lady. So now she calmly went to the conductor of her carriage and poured out a heart-wrenching story of her great, unrequited love. Lowering her eyes, she admitted that she wanted to surprise her beloved, who had no idea they were now traveling on the same train. All she asked for was a simple thing: to switch her seat in her compartment for one in the compartment of her chosen man, without asking his consent. That day, the duty conductor was an elderly man who had seen much in his life. He didn't pry into the girl's soul or ask for details. He simply did what was in his power and resettled her where she so eagerly wanted to be. After all, hadn't he himself once known such impulses? And didn't he still remember his own love for his wife? Completely unaware of Espiransa's maneuvering, Esteban at that moment was already mulling over how strange the whole situation with the documents seemed. Why was he personally carrying them? Why couldn't the paperwork be sent to China by some other means? And why had his bosses in Buenos Aires wished him creative success before his departure? When Esperanza's head appeared in the doorway of the compartment, Esteban froze for a moment. His first thought was, just what I needed. But since the conductor had officially reassigned her, the girl now occupied the seat with full rights, and there was nothing he could do about it. Espiransa immediately went on the offensive. She grabbed the sheets of paper that Esteban had been trying to dry and told him, "I know Chinese very well, Esteban. Are you going to China to sing?" The question made Esteban's hair stand on end. Who is she? How does she know my name? What is going on here? He hurled all these questions at her at once, and Espiransa didn't lie. She told him everything openly, starting with how she had been in love with him as a 10-year-old girl, and finishing with Jean Valentin's assignment. In the end, she asked, "May I read the part of the documents written in Chinese? Something about them unsettles me." Still dazed by the typhoon-like entrance of Espiransa, Esteban silently nodded. He was lost in memories of his youth, but he could not recall the little girl who had studied with him in music school. What was their age difference? 7, 8 years? She had already endured such a crucible of trials. In Esteban's heart, there wasn't a drop of condemnation. Espiransa had become a thief. But could he judge her for that? Back home, he had always had parents and a younger brother waiting for him. Espiransa, by contrast, had known grief, sorrow, illness, homelessness, and despair. Meanwhile, Espiransa carefully read the Chinese documents and was astonished at Esteban's ignorance. What she found seemed fantastic. The fasteners were mentioned only briefly. Among the sheets was another agreement that Esteban would perform solo concerts in a number of Chinese cities, remain in China for long months of his own accord, with huge breaks between performances, all for a laughably small fee. It looked as if the Chinese partners had agreed to buy the bolts and nuts only on the condition that Esteban's vocal talent would come as a nearly free bonus. But this was absurd. Espiransa was completely entangled in this cunning web of rights and obligations. Nonsense, not a contract. Or perhaps she was missing something. And what did this have to do with her assignment in Jean Valentin? She read through it all again, carefully, and then relayed to Esteban everything the contract contained. He could not believe his ears. Someone had arranged concert tours behind his back? Why was it all like this? Did it mean he hadn't earned his marketing director post on his own merits? His voice was part of the deal. Or had he misunderstood everything? Outside, the scenery raced by, the train hurried along its route, and Esteban sat in complete confusion. He didn't want to sing like this, especially not in China. He didn't know what to do with the trip, or with his unwilling companion. She had defied her boss. What would that mean for her now? Would harsh punishment follow for her disobedience? He also felt deeply insulted by the deception. Hadn't he earned the right to be dealt with honestly? Espiransa, now warmed after the rain, stayed silent, as if sensing the inner battle raging within Esteban. Soon, the man for whom she had gone all in made his decision. He would not fly to Beijing. He would not return to a company that had tried to sell his talent in such a strange way. And he would not abandon the girl who had risked so much for him. Sometimes a single act, a choice, changes our fate completely. Esteban once read an article that said every new choice triggers another choice, creating an endless chain of events. And that very first choice can become the trigger for an entire future. He asked Espiransa only one question. "How old are you, my unexpected companion and helper?" "In 2 weeks, I'll be 20, she replied. "Perfect then. It means we'll stake our future together. You at 20, me at 28. Esteban picked up the documents from the table and began tearing them into tiny pieces. Espiransa hesitated only a few seconds before joining him. Soon all that remained on the table was a pile of shredded paper. On some fragments, faint traces of still wet dirt were visible. To keep himself from changing his mind, Esteban pulled out his plane ticket. He studied it for a while, then tore it into miniature scraps as well. After a pause, he thought of pulling out his lighter to burn it all, but refrained. They were still on the train, passengers already sleeping peacefully in the carriage. No need to risk attracting attention. He didn't ask her whether she would follow him. He gave no explanations, told her nothing. In Espiransa's large gray eyes, Esteban had already read every answer. For some unknown reason, in some inexplicable way, he was certain this small, brave girl with her difficult past would go with him. The next morning, 2 figures stepped off the express train, a tall, broad-shouldered man and a petite slip of a girl. He carried a large bag. A small woman's backpack was strapped to her shoulders. They walked down the platform in silence, but he held her hand as if she were a child walking beside him. Leaving the Cordoba station, they disappeared into the crowd. Half an hour later, once they were far enough from the station, Esteban made a single phone call. "It's me. You once told me I could turn to you for help if ever I reached the edge and could go no further. That time has come." After listening to the reply, Esteban nodded to Espiransa. "They're waiting for us. It's now or never. All or nothing." Twilight falls early over the Atacama Desert, cloaking the place in mystery and romance. There in the highland oasis of Calchines, on the shore of a salt lake, Esteban and Espiransa had already been living for 5 years. They served as caretakers of a house owned by an influential figure who disliked letting strangers into his life. The master rarely visited his estate, and during those times among the rocks one could hear the sounds of melodic singing. There was but one listener, along with the silent cacti. Near Calchines, nicknamed the Castle of the Sun because the orange star seldom leaves these skies, such moments were rare. And everyone in the area knew the elderly gentleman in the broad-brimmed light hat was trying to heal his wounded, sinful soul. He had saved, welcomed, and supported the couple because, in his youth, he had deeply loved a woman. His status and rank had forbidden him from having a family. He defied the rules and paid dearly. His enemies destroyed the woman he loved and their small son. Now, years later, as an aging wolf, he desperately sought to atone for his mistakes. When he first saw Esteban, something stirred in his heart. An old wound began to bleed, and he swore to himself his son would be about the same age as this gifted young singer. If this remarkable vocalist ever needed help, he would do everything in his power, no matter the cost. In the meantime, much had changed in the lives of the pair under his care. Pity and solidarity had grown into deep, true love. Esteban and Espiransa never registered their marriage, yet this didn't stop them from raising 2 sons. Sometimes Esteban laughed carelessly and declared they wouldn't stop there. They would surely have a daughter. Espiransa agreed with her beloved. The ice had forever melted in her gray eyes. For this reason, their benefactor never told her that her escape had cost Jean Valentin his life. The mysterious contract, which turned out to exist in different versions, remained full of oddities. No one ever understood what connection Chinese gangsters had to Esteban's singing. Rumor had it that one of their sons had been enchanted by his voice, and they had tried to lure him to China under false pretenses, never to let him leave. But such tales were told in whispers. Who could say what was truth and what was fiction? The contract for fasteners was real, but it was quickly annulled for reasons unknown. Perhaps the rivals' quarrel had never been serious to begin with. Jean Valentin became a victim of these intrigues only because he didn't report immediately that his best protege had fled. An expensive diamond necklace, offered as a payoff to his boss, was considered far too little. Perhaps they had long been waiting to settle scores with him for past offenses, or maybe his time on this earth had simply run out. He fell silent forever, right in the doorway of the house where his makeshift school had been. His pupils learned of the tragedy quickly and vanished from the scene at once. Esteban sent word to his family. He told them he was alive and well, but would not be returning home soon. He also sent money for his younger brother's education. In a foreign land, Espiransa had become his everything. And Espiransa herself thought their life now resembled a fairy tale. A salt lake fed by thermal springs, ever-warm waters, fruit-bearing cacti, healing aloe, whimsical cliffs. Their home lay a little apart from a Quechua village, in a secluded place. Esteban and Espiransa loved to walk through the oasis, exploring the remains of an Inca settlement. In Atacama province, thankfully, they had never once run into familiar faces among Argentine tourists. And those curious enough to glance at the tanned foursome soon lost interest in the small gray-eyed woman flanked by her 3 knights, a tall, strong man and 2 sun-darkened boys. One day, a woman from Argentina, straying from her group while searching for her husband, hesitantly approached the smiling, petite stranger and asked in Spanish if she could show her the way. She was astonished when Espiransa replied in pure, fluent Spanish, "I saw your group." They headed to the station where guests ride llamas. "Come, I'll take you there." The reunited woman, relieved, couldn't help but ask, "Are you from Argentina? Do you live here permanently?" Espiransa smiled happily again and answered, "Once my beloved man asked me to follow him. not yet knowing where we would go. And I believed him at once, as if I had always dreamed he would call me into the unknown. That uncertainty turned into a fairy tale for us both. Under this sky, we said farewell to our past and truly found each other. Now I know for certain, if you love, you must tell your chosen one, take me with you. Then you will never regret the consequences.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.